Hey everyone, thanks for your patience. My name is Faizan Khan. I'm a director, app innovation specialist, which means I focus on intelligent applications, which are what most of our customers are not starting to, they've already started last year, but starting to expand upon. And what I'm going to talk about here is some of that trend. I'll dive a little bit deeper into the technical side a little later in the presentation, and we can go from there. But I work on Microsoft. I focus on the Azure stack. So as I mentioned, a lot of our customers, I work with some of our largest global customers in the financial services and insurance space. And the majority of our customers, if not all, have been exploring and implementing generative AI. So think of like Azure OpenAI, large language models, small language models into applications. And every customer is working on their use cases, fleshing them out, prioritizing them to introduce generative AI into their applications. So every app's going to be reinvented with it. New apps are going to include intelligence. Next slide. And part of the reason is a large portion of the reason is productivity increases, right? As an example, one large use case we're seeing, and Microsoft's implemented internally, call centers, right? And it's driven by generative AI and the ability for natural language analysis and personalization. So think of a call center employee now being an order of magnitude more productive and more personalized for their customer experience because you've got a generative AI application on the back end, understanding what's being spoken, understanding sentiment, understanding what the customer is looking for, being able to tap into data, pulling in information, presenting it to the call center representative so that the customer experience is better. And it's really the generative AI aspect of it is the reasoning and the understanding that's very different from a business logic function, which is a lot more hard-coded and doesn't have the reasoning capabilities. Next slide. So what we're seeing is focus on employee experiences, reinventing customer experiences, a lot of focus on business processes and taking what used to be a business process automation focus area, which was really hard-coded like logic, right? And analysis of documents, for example, but it was rigid. And taking that to be more reasoning focused is a large focus that we see customers looking into and implementing. And then product innovation. What's that next sort of product that's going to be intelligent and open up new business channels? Next slide. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different use cases. This one is outside of the financial services, so I'll keep it a little bit high level. But we have a lot of companies implementing generative AI into their applications, right? And ASOS on personalization and product discovery. Shein is an example of this. I don't know if Shein's an Azure customer, but they're just-in-time, highly intelligent AI, really disruptive in the retail industry. They're probably going to be one of the biggest retailers in the world over the next couple of years. Content generation and marketing. That's a very good use case for generative AI. I think CarMax's example was they summarized the feedback of customer reviews for 10,000 plus car models in days and weeks versus what would have taken months to do. Service and support, I mentioned the call center use case. Building your own Copilot. So the Copilot slash chatbot area is one of the first and largest focus areas for a number of customers. A large portion of my customers are looking at internal chatbots that are actually pulling data from internal knowledge bases, as an example, HR, finance, just broadly internal data, and making that and surfacing it to their employee base. And then there's the external chatbot solutions that do something similar but focus on customer experiences and what customers are looking for. Next slide. And then if we click on the financial services side of things, I mentioned Copilots. There's an example with KPMG where 70% of KPMG's employees have adopted KimChat with 120,000 requests. That's a very common scenario. I think almost every single one of my customers is implementing their own copilots and opening it up to their employee base. And the actual implementation can happen through our M365 Copilot solution, which we just actually announced phase 2 of. Extremely impressive capabilities there, including like Python in Excel. But then there's a pro dev version of Copilots as well, where it's more involved, it's tying into data sources, and more customized. Transaction processing and anomaly detection. Think of things like detecting fraud in claims, for example, which is a huge focus area. Information discovery and knowledge mining, similar to the Copilot scenario, but now using what we're calling as a retrieval augmented generation pattern, just to analyze thousands and thousands of documents and pulling the right information out of them. And then similarly, document intelligence and summarization. Next slide. So I also mentioned the product innovation side, or building new business channels. And that's a large focus area for customers as well. So Canary Speech, leveraging speech services and reasoning over speech services to create new AI-enabled services, modern requirements with AI-enabled automation, iCertis with contract management and document intelligence, and then the copilots that wrap around it. Next slide. So the double click on iCertis and some of the business value is reviewing contract reviews, accelerating by 40%. And that's the sort of thing we're seeing when introducing and implementing generative AI into applications correctly, is this huge productivity increase. Next slide. So if we look internally at Microsoft and what we're doing with our products, we're introducing and have introduced Gen AI into everything. So from Microsoft Copilot, which you can access via Bing and powered by OpenAI or Azure OpenAI, Copilot for Microsoft 365, which is that intelligence embedded into our entire Office line of products. I personally use Copilot every day. I had a TV presentation yesterday, and on the drive to the studio, I loaded all of the talking points into Copilot and leveraged voice chat with it, and asked it to be the host and treat me as a guest and kind of interview me and then critique my responses based on the actual facts and provide recommendations for improvement. So for an hour in my car, I'm practicing voice-based to do the TV spot. Just one personal example there. Teams, we use it all the time. Transcription, creation of action items, meeting summarization, follow-ups, etc. And then GitHub Copilot. This is a huge focus area for all of my customers. And we're seeing massive increases in developer productivity when GitHub Copilot is introduced. And that's a whole nother discussion, but the business value on that is just undeniable. Next slide. And if we take an industry pivot, there's just a ton of use cases across the industry. I focus on financial services, so fraud detection, document processing, support chatbots, claims, intelligent underwriting. And these are all areas where my customers are focusing and in kind of figuring out where to introduce Gen AI and how to maximize it. Next slide. And this is just a huge area from an economic and productivity and adoption perspective. So 1 billion new logical apps forecasted to be created in 2028. More than 80% of enterprises in about 2 years will have used some sort of Gen AI product in their application development. And then the acceleration of application modernization is just a huge focus area. Taking those legacy apps, making them cloud enabled, introducing Gen AI, doing that migration. It's just the ROIs on that are hugely beneficial, but specific to each app by app and organization by organization. Next slide. And just a couple points on considerations around this business and use case, right? The ROI I mentioned. Why are you doing this? important to consider and define success criteria. It's a fast-moving space, so innovation in AI models is happening all the time. OpenAI just released 4.01, I think it is, which I've personally used, and it's incredible how it reasons over data. Developer skilling tools, right? I mentioned GitHub Copilot. That adoption, that innovation, and that the evolution of that capability is just it's rapid, right? And when you think of rapid, it's going organizationally, it's going to impact things like education and skilling and making sure your teams are up to speed on how to leverage these best, as well as your application architectures. How do you ensure it's almost like a don't let perfect get in the way of good enough. There's so much innovation happening in this space that you want to make your application architectures almost a little bit plug and play in terms of the models you're using because you will evolve them, right? So in Azure, there's thousands of models available for use. But each of those models are going to evolve themselves, right? And so you're going to want to upgrade them and potentially leverage the right one for the right job. There's cost implications as well, small language models versus large language models. There's a lot of considerations here. And then finally, the security and scale and performance is key. I have global customers. Azure, I think, not I think, it's one of the largest clouds, if not the largest global network. And that's important when we think of like scale and availability and always on and those sorts of things as well. And security is a huge focus area as well. So a lot of Azure is focused on that and it's built in. We run on trust. That's it. That's the mantra. And that kind of permeates through all our products. Next slide. Next slide. Ron, how am I doing on time?
Well, let's see, it's 1:24, so we're good 5-10 minutes more. It's really up to you.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah. I just didn't want to cut into
Yeah.
my co-speaker's time. So developing new intelligent apps faster. I mentioned GitHub Copilot. It's a must, right? That sort of solution is introducing actual productivity gains. All of this is. Months faster to market for new apps, increasing worker output, just all from a productivity perspective. I think I saw analysis that this whole Gen AI and this whole AI phase is going to increase our global economy by around $20 trillion by 2030, I think it was. So that's just a reflection of this productivity gain that's going to happen or is starting to happen. Next slide. From a platform perspective, I mentioned developer tools like GitHub Copilot, Visual Studio. Azure as a platform itself has purpose-built infrastructure for AI. I think I've got a deeper slide later on, but it's real quick. InfiniBand for the fastest networking capability and inter-server communication, GPUs, FPUs, storage that's performant and tuned for AI. We run Azure with AI, so a lot of the way Azure is run itself and self-healing, et cetera, is driven by AI. And then on top of that, our app data and AI platforms are built. And I think I've got more detail later on. Next slide. And in terms of the technical capabilities of Azure as a platform and the offerings, I mentioned performance. Microsoft is a developer company, so focused on GitHub and Visual Studio and .NET and open source and Java. All of those, I mentioned the thousands of models available through Azure AI Studio. It's just a huge focus area, and it's all about our developers and then business outcomes as well. One of the important things there is just the investment that's been done in OpenAI, which is one of, if not the leader in the generative AI space. And that allows Microsoft to, OpenAI runs on Azure, so that's one. But from an investment perspective, when OpenAI releases something, we're releasing it essentially in parallel. So the latest version of 4.01, I think it is now available in Azure OpenAI Studio. But before we release it, there's a whole security, governance, all of that, those considerations are put in, and enterprise readiness that's put into place when it's available in Azure OpenAI Studio. Next slide.
That is a good point. Just to chime in for a
Yeah,
second.
go for it.
Uh, One of the big things you hear, and it's somewhat analogous to open source or running your virtual machines. You can run a lot of this on bare metal servers in your own data center in a co-location place. We, having worked with many large enterprises, always say you must work with one of the hyperscalers. You can't set up OpenAI yourself. I'm sure many of your employees try it out. They might try it in Anthropic or Llama or the other applications. But if you're a company of any size, just like you don't want to have lots of Linux running around without the security, performance, compliance features built into Azure, or quite honestly within AWS as well, that's my key recommendation that I just want to reinforce here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Ron. And there's tons of economic studies showing the cost of running it in a hyperscaler is going to be lower. But that security and that governance and all of that whole space is super critical. So Microsoft has, just to go on a quick tangent, global visibility into security, cybercrime, criminals, etc. You can read about it. We're involved in shutting down that sort of thing. But that telemetry that comes in globally it influences our security stack. And what we're seeing is just these nation states are becoming more and more, it's a business, right? For them. And they're becoming way more sophisticated in their ability to do a cyber attack. And leveraging a hyperscaler, and Azure in this case, is going to set you up for that security success. It's important. Next slide. So I mentioned some of this. Next slide. A few more customer examples here. I'll just leave this for reference. Next slide. Right. So just a double click a bit more on the security side, just because it's so important, and availability, right? So I mentioned global data centers, being able to do active, always on sorts of architectures and implementations. Having that global visibility and security results in fewer security breaches for our customers. And when you do it right, because everything is infrastructure as code, you've got your CI/CD pipelines set up correctly. If there's a focus on developer automation, there's a huge efficiency increase possible with just taking a look at that entire stack of everything I just mentioned for making your developers more efficient. And in this example, it's 87% less time in deploying IT resources. So if you think of things like DevBox or self-service and automation and building environments as you're deploying your code and breaking them down because of elasticity. I mean, all of that is something my customers are focused on as well. Next slide. I mentioned this. Next slide. So yeah, this is what I want to focus on. I'll take about 5 minutes. We'll use this for reference. I wanted to share a couple of different architectural patterns that we're seeing. The retrieval augmented generation, or RAG pattern in Azure, leverages a number of different services. But effectively, what this is doing is it is addressing the hallucination aspect of language models, where a language model might make something up, right? Unless you prompt engineer it correctly, et cetera. So leveraging something like Azure OpenAI Studio or Copilot Studio, low code for Copilot, pro code for Azure AI Studio, against your own content or your curated content, using something like Azure Cognitive Search, which has vector-based search, it's vector-based indexing capabilities or hybrid indexing capabilities to understand your content. Like documents is often a typical case. We're using document intelligence. We're understanding the content. We're putting it into the search index. When you go to your bot and leverage a large language model like Azure OpenAI to understand what the customer is asking the bot or speaking to the bot, like I was doing yesterday. The language model interprets that, reasons over it, sends the search to cognitive search, which then pulls the information from your curated content so that it's accurate, it's specific, it's what the customer is looking for. So there's a very common pattern, RAG. Next slide. I mentioned search. This is a little more detail on Azure AI Search. Next slide. I mentioned this as well in terms of vector search, hybrid search, some of the capabilities around Azure AI Search. Hybrid search is somewhat unique in terms of it combining both keyword capabilities and vector capabilities. But it's all around speed and higher relevance for the content that's retrieved. Next slide. So a pattern this is kind of the evolution, right? So RAG is kind of the first one, typically tied to copilots, but not necessarily. These agentic-based architectures is what we're speaking with customers about now. And this is the ability to do this is the function of the maturation of models, right? The introduction of optimized models like small language models, 5.3, large language models, etc. The ability to tune models when needed. You don't really need to do it for most instances, but you can for your specific use case. We're talking about agentic architectures, and that allows for more specificity and more reasoning. Next slide. And effectively what it is introducing an orchestration layer that's intelligent, that understands the next layer down of agents that are available. Those agents might be an underwriting agent, a claims agent, a sales agent, an HR, or whatever sort of business function that's needed, but it's tuned or scoped to that specific function. The Uber orchestrator knows where to go and take a request, send it to the child agents that are now going to reason specifically on that domain, and then send the information back up to the orchestrator or a different function for aggregation. This is interesting because this is now going deeper into business logic within an application, almost microservices approach, leveraging Gen AI. So this is something we're talking to customers about quite a bit. Next slide. And then part of what can enable this is functions, which is microservices. So a function is just it's that micro environment for running specific pieces of code, and it allows for running that code, getting input, output, responses, etc. Scale in, scale out. You can click again, Ron. And it's just it's Azure Functions is the name of the service, but we're seeing it more and more in these sorts of intelligent architectures. Next slide. I won't drain this one, but the reason why I want to keep it here is because for reference, there's a number of Azure services you can put together. Cosmos DB is one that's highly adopted across the customer base. I mentioned Azure AI Search, but storage, the type of GPUs you're going to use, the Azure OpenAI, et cetera, to really put together this sort of architecture. Next slide. And Ron, I'm at 5 minutes over the half hour, so I'll wrap it up in the next minute. This is an example of underwriter copilot, right? So taking a business function like underwriting, introducing AI-assisted experiences, agentic approaches for the functions that are outlined in each one of these boxes. And I think the next slide might be my last one. Yeah. So I won't go into the next section, but I've got the link to the deck in the chat. Really appreciate everyone's time and allowing me to kind of present this super exciting area of what we're seeing all of our customers do and what's really going to be game changing for the world.